Welcome to Help Me Coder, the channel which talks about technology and helps the coder community out there. And in this video, we are going to look into what is controller. As we know, controller are the centerpiece of any ASP.NET MVC application. Now their job is to look for any incoming request and then provide an appropriate response based on that request. So between this request and response, they get their data by any service layer, which is basically the model, and then use this data to inject it into a view which gets displayed on your browser.
Spread it back.
So if I go to this slide over here, this picture, if you remember and if you have seen my earlier video, this we have covered in part 1 of ASP.NET MVC series. So the controller sits over here, which is the centerpiece. Now when a user requests for a page by providing a URL or clicking a link, the link goes to the route engine where it finds out like which controller has to be called. Based on that URL or the click of a link, the appropriate controller is called, and then appropriate action method in that is controller is called. Then this controller job is to get the data and process the data which it can get through the model layer. Then it processes the data, and after the processing, it injects that data into this view layer over here, which basically end up showing you the data or the page on the browser. So this is the whole flow of how data flows in an ASP.NET MVC application. So now let us go and create our first controller. So I will switch to my Visual Studio. So this was the solution that we created during our part 1 video in our ASP.NET MVC series. To create a controller, go to the controller folder that you see over here, and then you go to add a controller, and over here in this scaffolding engine you will see that there are a lot of different controllers you can choose from. And now each of these options that you have over here come up with some boilerplate code. So once you use that, it will give you some boilerplate code which makes life for a developer easy. Now for this demonstration I will use the empty controller, and I will create a controller over here. Now once it again give you a dialog box where it asks you to provide the name of the controller, don't remove the whole thing from here, just provide the name of the controller. You need to have the name controller over here. So to do that, you can just type in the name. Let us say that you are going to create a student controller. So I will click on the word add over here. So this scaffolding engine will give you, or it will load up the appropriate controller for you. So couple of things to be noted over here. First thing is that the controller class is derived from system.web.mvc.controller. So this one. Then second thing is that it consists of public action methods. So what are action method, we will see in the later part of the video. Then third thing is that, as I said earlier, that the prefix of the any controller name should be the name that you want to define, but it should always suffix with the word controller. Then other point to note over is that you cannot overload the controller class. So one said that you can always say that we can do that. There are ways to do that, and I will show you later how you can do that. But normally if you try to overload the controller class, it will give you a warning message, error message, saying that it is an ambiguous request. So if I can show you, if I just copy this over here and I paste it below. Now if I change this one as INTI, and if I try to run this, normally in any .NET base application you will not find an error. Even in compile time it is not giving an error, but once you run this, it will definitely show you an error. So let us see that. So before that, let me show you how to create a view out of a controller. So to create a view where basically the page that gets shown when you because this is not the page, it just passes the request from, it comes over here and it redirects it to a specific page. So to create a view page, you can click in the middle of this any of the action method, and over here you can go to and add a view, and then you can just name, don't worry about what is this, just name the view name. So for example, I can just name it as index. So the scaffolding engine will create the index CSS. So this is the page that gets displayed on the browser. Now let's go back to the controller, student controller. Now over here, now if I try to run this, let's see what happened. I have done an overloading of an action method. Because the name of the controller is student, so I will just type the word student. So once you type in, it says clearly that the current request for action index on controller type student controller is ambiguous because of the following action method. So you have index and index32, but when you type student, by default it launches index, but which index method to call it doesn't know. So that's the reason this is the error that it provides you. Now let's go back and let me stop the debugging part. Let me remove this code. So these are some of the pointers to note, but still we can overload it. I will show you how to do the overloading in later part of the audio, so keep watching. So these were the pointers that I was talking about. Now let's look into the overall journey of a controller. So the journey means from the time when you type in the URL or you click on a link on your MVC application, and to the time when the view of that particular page loads up on your screen or on your browser. Now once you type in the URL, you can divide the URL into various sections. So the first part of the section will be your website name or the portal name that you have. Then after that .com URL or whatever, if you have an intranet application, the domain name, then you will have a slash sign, and after that you will have the name of the controller. So this is the class file, so the name of the controller. Then on that you will have again a slash sign, and over there you will have the name of the action method. So as you remember that we showed you that there were a lot of action methods, those public methods that I was talking about. So these are the action methods. So once you see those action methods, then you can, after that you can have again a slash, and you can type in the ID parameters over there. So for example, if you want to get a student with an ID of 5, then you can type something like slash student slash index slash 5 or 3. Then basically it will get you the details. So it will pass 3 or 5 as a parameter to that particular method. So this whole URL is basically understood by the MVC application using a route config file that we have. Now how this route config file works, so it's really better if I go into the application itself. So let's go into the solution. So the routing magic starts from this file, which is the global.ascx.cs. So whenever your MVC application start, this file gets called, which in turns register these files, which are like your bundle, route, and the filter config files, which are under your app start. Now once your route config gets called, which gets called from here, this one gets called, or over here you have a predefined route, which is like this is called the default route. You can create your own route if you want. And over here, if you see that, you will have a controller, then an action, and then an ID. Also you have some defaults parameter, means if for example if you don't provide a controller, action, ID, you just provide the URL, which is the domain name, then you can you by default the home controller will get called. If you are passing example the controller name and you don't provide action and ID, then by default the index action method under your controller will get called. So every controller has an index method when it gets created the default way. Now if I show you this with an example, let me run this application. So So over here, if you see that by default we have not provided any controller name, so it is loading by default the home controller, and under that home controller it is by loading by default the index method. So let's say if we are calling our student controller that we just created and we don't specify the action method, so what we type is the student. So you see that by default it is loading the index method. So let me go back to my solution and let me go back to my student controller. So in this student controller it's loading the index method by default. I'm not specifying the index word over here, or if you specifically specify that word, it will still load the same page. So it will still load the same page. Now let's add one more action method over here. So let me go back to my solution and I will copy paste this one, and I have to stop the debugging first. So, and I will say get more. Okay, so let's say we have this one. Now definitely it's an action result. Let's say I have a string return type, because else I will have to create a view. So done Hemant, just for the sake of this example. Now let me run this and let's see what happens. So it will again load the default controller, which is your home controller based on your route file. And now if I want to change it to student and I want to specifically call the controller, the new action method that I wanted just created, then I can type get more over here, and once I type you see the word Hemant. Now let's see one more thing. How can I change the default controller to load as student instead of the one we just saw? So what I can go is I can go back to my solution, stop debugging, go back to my routing config, change the controller name from home to student. Just build this solution and that's it. So once you do that, by default you have changed the routing configs. Now in this, what will happen is by default when you run this, it will load the student controller instead of the home controller. That's it. So it's loading the student controller currently. So it's the same student controller. I think you may not know by this looking at it, but it is the student controller. So that's how the route config work, and that are those default values. Now let me show you one more thing which I have not shown till now, the ID value. Now let's say you want to pass the ID value. Let's go back to our student controller, and in this get more method I am passing an ID. So I'm saying int ID and I'm just printing that ID over here, or return ID. That's it. I have to change this to int. That's it. So what I'm trying to do over here is that, see, in the route config, this word ID, you have to use the word ID over here to make it work. If you use something else, it will not work because we have specifically marked it as an ID. You can change that, but then you have to change it over here in the route config. Now let's run this. So it will load again the student controller over here. So get more and then the 5. So that's it. So it starts displaying 5. So you have passed an ID. Now as I told earlier, we cannot change the word ID. Let's try to do it without an ID, and let me say it is ID 12 and I press ID 12. Okay, and now let me run this. Now you will see that once I run this, again, it loads student controller, so I will have to type student, and then I will say get more, and then I will say 5. Okay, so this one is straight away because dictionary contains a null entry from parameter id 12, because in your route config you specifically said that it will accept id. So that's why once you choose as id 12 it stops working. So if you go back to your solution, in your route config you just change it to id 12, this one, and then you build the solution. And then you run it, and I say student get more, and then I say 5. Yep, it starts working again. So that's how the route config can be changed. You can change the order, the parameters, the values, you can change the default value. So this is how it works. Now we have gone through the journey of a controller. We have seen how the URL look like and how it is deciphered into a particular controller and an action method, how the routing engine does that for us. Now let's have some action. So as we have seen till now that there are a lot of public methods, those we called as action methods, that are part of the controller that you write. Now these action methods play a very important role. They have a return type called as action result, where in ASP.NET MVC we can have lot of different action results, and each of these action results that we have provide a different kind of return, where based on the type of output that you require. So there are like view result, there is like redirect result. So based on the output that you require, you will use the corresponding action result over here. Now each of these action result method have a helper method which helps to send the response back. Now for example, view result have a helper method called view, and redirect result have a helper method called redirect. Let me go back to the solution and show you how this all works. By default we have been till now using action result method, which is basically the base class for all those different action results I just show you. So if you want to be very specific on what you want to return, then you can just remove this one with the more specific version. So for example, view over here is a helper method for view result, correct? So what I can change it over here to is as view result. Now once I change this means that this will still work. So it returns or it calls the corresponding view for this particular action method. So that's the role for this helper method of the particular action result. Let's see another action result which is called redirect result, and so to use that we just change this return type to redirect result. Once you choose that, you will see that it will start giving you error over here, because view is definitely not a helper method for redirect result, so it will give you an error over here. So what I have to do over here is to change it to redirect. So this is the helper method that it anticipates. Now over here this will accept one argument. So over here I will need to specify the location of redirect. So I can specify the controller name. For example, if I want to take it to students, and then under that I want to call get more, for example, and then as it is an accepting ID parameter, I need to pass something like 5 over here. Now let's save that and run this. So the work of redirect result action method is to redirect any request that comes into this action method onto another place. So over here what I'm trying to do is passing it to this particular action method, which is get more. Let's see how it works. So once you click on this one, and if you go to your student So by default, if I run this will call the index method, but for this sake let me call just the index like this. And once you run this, see it redirects you to the get more 5. So that based on the type of output that you want from your action method, you need to change these action results method. So earlier I promised you that I will be showing you how we can overload the action method in ASP.NET MVC. So to do that, we have something called as action selector. So there are a couple of action selectors like your action name, non-action, and action verb. Out of this you can use action name and action verbs to overload it. Let me show you how it can be done. Let me go back to the project. So what I will do over here is I will use the same method. So I will try to overload it. So to overload it, I will have a int id value over here. So this is an overloaded method for the index with a parameter, and instead of redirecting it, let me just type in as string, or let me keep it as int, and then I will return the id that we have over here. Now in an idle case, if I run this and if I try to access the index page, it will give me an ambiguous error. But now if I want to still run this, I can give a different name. I can say action name, and I can provide the name over here. So I can say it is a overloaded action. So once I do that and save it, and if I run it now, so by default it will load the index method, which basically does what is it redirects it to this method. So that's why it's returning 5 over here, and it passes 5 value to this method, and you see the 5 on the screen. What if I want to run this method? So I will use this action name, and I will change the get more 5, and I will pass, for example, 20. Now see, this one returns 20. So this one is calling this method now. Let me debug it for you. So if I change this, and let me show you. So it comes to this method, and I can pass it and it displays it over here. But if I go ahead and just type student with the index, it will load the first one. So that's how you can overload it with the same name, but you need to provide a separate action name over here. Also, if I go back to this one, you have something called as action verb. Action verb is basically to differentiate between get and post requests. So we will understand more of this in our future videos, but to just give you a brief introduction on how this is done is, if for example the same method can be used for the get and the post response. So for example, this one is a get one. Now if I want to change this one to a post, what I can do is I can add HTTP. So you have so many different options over here to choose from. I will choose HTTP post. So the main reason why we use this is to call this method based on the post request, or whether it is a get request. So based on the different kind of requests. For example, if you have a form, on that form you have filled in some information, and once you hit the submit key, this method may get called, not the first one. So based on your request type, this methods gets called. We'll discuss more on this in the future video. This completes our discussion on controller. Hope you would have liked it. I tried to cover all the different nitty-gritty things that are part of those controllers, from the routing to the action results to how they get called and what are those. So if I have missed anything, do let me know in the comment section below. Also do remember to like and subscribe our channel Help Me Coder. Thanks for watching. See you till next time. Happy coding.